3 years after his wife's death, Will still made 2 cups of coffee every morning, one for himself and one for someone no longer there. Until one day, he saw a pregnant girl being auctioned off like merchandise. He unbuckled his gun, set it down, and chose to stay, with someone no one else wanted to keep. The sky hadn't fully brightened yet. Only a pale, ashen light crept through the dust-stained curtain, like an old man's gaze, unhurried, unexpectant. Will Harrow sat up in silence. No yawning, no creaking wood, just the sound of wind brushing across the porch, like a hand passing gently over the back of an old coat, not out of affection nor out of familiarity. He dressed slowly, the shirt still folded neatly on the bedpost from last night. One cuff frayed. He didn't mind. He put on his worn leather boots, braced his hand on the bedpost, and walked to the kitchen like someone entering a habit too old to need remembering. The coffee pot sat on the wood stove from the night before. He cleared the ashes and rekindled the fire with a few dry sticks, without haste. Everything in this house moved slowly, as if rushing might shatter something fragile. When the water boiled, he didn't need to look. The faint bubbling was enough for his hands to remember. He took out 2 gray enamel mugs, one chipped at the rim, the same set as the sugar jar with a peeled label. He poured the coffee evenly. One for himself. One he placed on an old ceramic plate, carrying it out to the porch. The wicker chair across from him had faded in the sun. On the backrest, the worn patch where his wife used to sit remained, where she would lean, embroidering fine threads, until the light grew too dim to tell moss green from silver. Will set the coffee down on the small table between the 2 chairs. He didn't look at the cup, didn't look at the chair. He simply sat in his own seat, holding the steaming cup like it contained a warmth that had nearly vanished. He did this every day, for 3 years. No one told him to. No one knew he did. But he still woke early, brewed the coffee, and set out 2 cups, not because he believed the dead still lingered, but because in the quiet space between 2 cups, he could still hear something in himself that he wasn't ready to let go. The scent of coffee mingled with morning mist, carrying the smell of dry earth, half-dried laundry, and something deeply familiar, like the scent of the hair of the woman who sat opposite him for years, never needing to ask if he'd slept well. Sometimes Will still looked in that direction, not hoping to see again, but because the act of looking helped him remember. Someone had once stayed. Beneath the porch, the lavender pots she'd planted had withered since last season. He didn't change the soil, didn't cut the stems, didn't sow new seeds. As if by leaving them be, some hadn't run out of grace. He sipped once, then set the cup down. His calloused fingers brushed the table's edge like feeling for something no longer stored in memory. Wind slipped through the door's crack, making the little bell on the porch chime ever so faintly. It didn't ring, just trembled, like someone wanting to speak, but still unsure. Every morning was like that, the second cup still steaming, though no one ever touched it. He never spoke her name, never murmured to himself, like lonely men sometimes do. Will Harrow didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't pray. He just sat there, like a shadow. Someone had once been patient enough to sit beside. And right there, in the space between 2 wooden chairs, this story will begin. Not with a gunshot, not with a scream, but with a cup of coffee poured from habit, yet managing to preserve something deeply human. Will Harrow's ranch lay south of Red Hollow, about 20 minutes by horse from the main road. Longer if the wind worked against you. No one visited, no one borrowed tools. Everything on that land, even sorrow, lived and died on its own. People in town called him Old Will the Aloof, not because he was angry, just because he had nothing left to say. Or more truthfully, because no one gave him reason to speak anymore. Back then, his wife Miriam had done all the talking for him. At the market, she picked the vegetables, paid the coins, smiled in place of his small talk. He'd just stand beside her, holding the basket, nodding when needed. No one complained, because Miriam's eyes always sparkled just enough to make the whole town believe Will was listening to the world, not hiding from it. Now, she was gone, and the world had stopped checking in on him. Every day started the same. After coffee, he stepped down from the porch in cracked boots, sliding his hand across the railing as if her warmth still lingered there. His left hand often brushed the porch post where Miriam had once tied up wild grapevines. The vines were dead now. Will didn't cut them. He passed the well, filled a bucket for the horse and another for himself. No basin, no saving. Just enough was enough. The livestock shed held only a few old hens. He let them out in the morning, gathered the eggs at dusk. No calling, no clapping. The hens knew the time, Miriam used to say. The backyard garden still had ragged rows, where she once grew mustard greens and red amaranth. Will didn't touch it, didn't clear it, left it be, as if trampling it over, always in silence. No radio, no open windows. When he swallowed, his throat sometimes felt dry, like he was gulping down words never said in time. He once tried writing a letter to his wife after she passed, but after 3 lines his hand stopped, not from lack of words, but because finishing it would force him to admit no one needed those words anymore. Each evening he'd walk once around the ranch, not to check fences, not to kill time, just to remember what it felt like to walk beside someone, and the way 2 shadows looked when they fell on the earth together. In a wooden drawer in his bedroom he kept the letters she wrote while alive. The paper yellowed, handwriting slightly tilted. He didn't read them aloud, just opened them, looked, and folded them back.
能力8錢
As if what he truly wanted to preserve wasn't the content, but the presence, the quiet knowing that someone had once sat down, held a pen, and thought of him. Will Harrow didn't speak much, not because he didn't know how, but because once he'd had someone who understood him without needing words. And when that person left, he found no one else worthy of the things left unsaid. That evening Will stood outside the chicken coop, hand gripping the wooden post, eyes on the sky burning red over the mountains. He didn't know, and didn't need to know, that someday someone would stand on his porch, hands wrapped around a swollen belly, eyes full of dust and silence, and he would have to choose between living with memory or getting up to make another cup of coffee, no longer for the one who was gone. On a Thursday morning, Will Harrow rode into town. The sky was gray like ashes after a forgotten celebration. A breeze tugged at his coat just enough to reveal the dust. Clinging to it wasn't only from yesterday. He hadn't planned to stop anywhere but the hardware store for nails and some cornmeal, but when he turned down the alley behind the old church, at the edge of town where maps stopped bothering with names, Will had to pull the reins. The air there felt different, not bustling like a market, not peaceful like a ranch, but thick, like something was happening that everyone knew, yet no one dared name. A small group had gathered, no more than 10. All were silent, heads slightly bowed, but their eyes pointed to the same spot. Hoda, how he had turned me that young breek. I was on his harzoppers for Unmore, along with Inferd and you. A young woman standing among 3 men. She wasn't standing tall, but she wasn't slumped either. Her wrinkled gray dress clung with dried mud at the hem, like she'd walked a long road with no one waiting at the end. Her arms hung loose, one hand curled protectively over her belly, round and tight under the fabric, a confirmation that needed no words. Her hair, light brown, almost gold, was swept across one cheek by the wind. No hat, no scarf, nothing shielding her except the way her eyes stared at the ground, as if she stared long enough she might disappear into it. There was no sign reading, "Auction!" No one calling out, "Who'll bid higher?" Only a man in a black vest, face wrinkled like a dried plum, arms folded across his chest, speaking in a flat voice, not quite threatening, but devoid of mercy. She's healthy, baby's near full term, eats little, sleeps well, no complaints. Anyone needing a house girl or childminder? She won't be any trouble. No one answered. A fat man with grease-darkened hands muttered, without even looking at her, "I'm not bringing home 2 mouths to feed. I'm buying labor, not baggage." A young man near Will whispered to his friend, probably knocked up by some guy who ran, "Look, nobody's here standing up for her." Will said nothing, but his fingers tightened on the reins. That woman, she was clearly being sold without anyone having to say it, priced in silence, traded like someone might swap out a lame horse for a new set of shoes, without asking if the animal felt pain. But what stopped Will from walking away wasn't the pregnant belly. It wasn't even the injustice. It was her eyes. She didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't challenge. She just looked down, as if she had grown used to people looking up just long enough to judge, then looking away so they wouldn't feel guilty. And because she didn't react, everything happened easily, like tossing a sack onto the dirt and asking who wanted to pick it up. Will had seen eyes like that before. The last time was in the mirror, on the day he stood by his wife's grave, with no one else at the funeral but the wind, the eyes of someone who no longer had anyone to hold on to, but also had nothing left to lose. Eyes that didn't cry, because there was no place left where tears could dry. He pulled the reins, nudging the horse forward. One more step. No one turned around. Because in places where injustice happens most quietly, people always choose not to see. But Will Harrow saw, and from that moment, something small but irreversible began. A man, after many years, could no longer turn away. The wind swept down the street corner, tossing dry straw around the fence posts. A scrap of silver paper spun in the dust before getting caught under Will's boot. He didn't bend to pick it up. His eyes were locked on the girl's face, not for her looks, not for her condition, but for the silence that made others fall silent too. She stood there, frame folded in like the last ember in a cold stove, still looking down, one hand over her belly, as if shielding something no one dared to touch. She didn't move, didn't tremble, as if by standing still long enough it would all pass. The wind would stop blowing, the shame would stop dragging on. One man in the group, the oldest, with a hunched back and pointed face, stepped forward, speaking with a voice both drawn out. "Now he's dead, and she's ours to carry. We're not doing anything cruel, we just can't afford another mouth to feed." No one argued, no one nodded. A woman standing at the roadside turned away, quickly pulling a scarf over her mouth. A butcher muttered, "Don't meddle in family matters." A seamstress quietly shut her shop door, as if the creak of the hinges could keep the shame from spilling into the narrow street. They didn't avert their gaze out of cruelty, but because they couldn't bear the truth unfolding in front of them, one they couldn't stop. Because to look is to see, and to see is to be forced to see yourself, and remember the times you turned away. Will remained still. The middle-aged man stepped closer to the girl, speaking as if pricing an old cow. "She's healthy, doesn't talk much. Baby's due soon, so you won't be waiting long. If you need someone in the house, she's quiet, doesn't argue. And if you need a wife, well, she won't complain." A short, dry laugh came from the man at the end of the group. Younger, probably the late husband's brother. The girl didn't move, didn't flinch, but a single strand of hair across her left cheek fluttered slightly in the wind. And that alone was enough for Will to tighten his grip on his hat, as if he'd just witnessed something sacred being touched without permission. He didn't know her name, didn't know why someone could be treated like merchandise in broad daylight, while no one spoke up. He only knew, when her eyes flicked toward him, there was no plea, no blame, just emptiness. A kind of emptiness that terrifies, not because it holds nothing, but because it once held everything and had been drained. Will dismounted, not in a rush, not hesitating. His boots hit the ground with a dry thud, like the first crack in long-held patience finally breaking. No one stopped him, but the air dropped heavy, like when a stranger steps into a mourning house where no one has cried yet. He walked slowly, eyes fixed on the girl. She kept looking down, and in that refusal to look up was how she survived. Because if she met their eyes, she might see her own shame mirrored back in the faces of former neighbors, those who used to smile at her at Sunday service, now quietly turning away. But Will didn't turn, and because of that, he became the only one who saw her not as property, but as a person. Change didn't begin with words. It began with a gaze that didn't leave, and a man who, after many years, no longer had the courage to pretend he didn't see. Will doesn't remember exactly how he said the words that followed. How much? It didn't come out like a gallant offer, not like a call for justice, nor the outburst of an angry man. It sounded more like toward him, as if he had ruined an old play where everyone already knew who played what role and how it would end. The oldest man, the one who had introduced the girl, narrowed his eyes and lowered his voice. "You serious about that?" Will didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, a slow, steady nod, without a tremble. People murmured. A dry cough echoed from the nearby saloon, mingling with the clack of a horse's hoof against hard ground, like the beat of something unnamed, waiting to break through. $50, the man said, his eyes steeped in the habit of bargaining, like the scent of old liquor clinging to his collar. "And your gun, the Winchester." Will unstrapped the rifle from his shoulder. His hand moved like a farmer lifting the last hoe of the season, without regret, without rush. He placed the gun before the man, then quietly pulled out a soft leather pouch from inside his coat and took out a few worn coins, counting them silently. His hand didn't shake, but each coin touching another made a sound like something greater falling, something no one wanted to name a price for anymore. The man nodded, snatching the gun so quickly that Will furrowed his brow slightly. The girl, who still hadn't raised her head, didn't move. But what happened next was something Will would remember for the rest of his life. He turned toward her. His voice wasn't loud, nor demanding. Just a single question, not a command, not an offering. "What's your name?" She looked up, slowly, very slowly. Her head lifted, as if an old wound lay at the base of her neck, not from pain, but from the fear that if she looked up she might see something she wasn't ready to face. Her eyes didn't glisten, no tears, only dryness, like earth that once knew rain but had long since grown used to cracking. And her voice, when it came, carried no hope, no resentment. Clara, a name. Something so small people might think it didn't matter. But the moment she said it, it separated her from the role she had been forced to play that day. She was no longer the pregnant girl, no longer a debt to be paid off, no longer the silent girl nobody asked about. From that moment on, she was Clara, and Will, the man who had just laid down the gun of his life, hadn't bought anyone. He had simply recognized someone who hadn't heard her own name, spoken right, in a very long time. Clara didn't walk toward him, and Will didn't offer his hand, but between them was a space quietly filled by what everyone else had forgotten, a kindness that asked for nothing in return. A woman nearby, arms wrapped around a basket of dry onions, exhaled softly, like something painful had just been allowed to end without needing to be named. A young man too long. Will lifted his hand, signaling toward the old wagon. No one rushed. No one stopped them. Clara walked slowly toward it, each step like pulling herself free from layers of dust and shame that once made her bow her head. No one wished her luck. But for the first time, someone in town began to remember she had a name. The wagon wheels creaked against dry earth, releasing a heavy, steady sound, like a sigh held too long and finally let go. Will sat at the front, reins in hand, eyes forward. Clara sat in the back, her back straight, hands over her belly, neither leaning nor asking where they were going. Between them was a scratched wooden crate, a few sacks of husked grain, a coil of old rope, and the smell of the tired old horse. On the road back to the ranch, neither said a word, but everything spoke, in the way only those who have lost can understand. One had just walked out of humiliation. One was relearning how not to feel like a savior. Wind swept across the ridge, blowing Clara's hair toward Will. He didn't turn, but he felt it. Not the scent of her hair, but the presence of someone who had once been treated as if she had no right to exist. The dirt road back to Will's ranch was narrow and scattered with stone. There was a bend near a patch of tall grass where his wife once held his hand walking through before sunrise. Back then, Miriam had said something he never forgot. People don't need to know how strong we are, just gentle enough that others don't feel they have to be strong next to us. Clara wasn't heavy. She didn't carry herself like a burden. But Will could sense it. She sat there as if she were the problem. A pregnancy treated like a weight, a life turned into a transaction, and now, a journey without a known destination, simply because a stranger had paid and hadn't laid a hand on her. Over his shoulder, Will glanced back, not to check, but because he'd heard an uneven breath. Clara sat upright, unleaning, but once she raised her hand to shield her face when they passed a fence where someone was repairing the boards. No one called her name, but the way they turned their faces away carried the shape of knowing and the fear of looking too long. Will didn't say, "It's going to be all right," because he understood. Sometimes that's the very sentence that breaks a person. As they neared the ranch, the wheels creaked louder. The old horse stretched its neck, recognizing the scent of familiar soil. Will pressed his heel gently, stopping the wagon near the porch, where dried lavender still lay quiet, like a promise no one had kept. He got off first, didn't offer a hand. Clara didn't wait for one. She stepped down on her own, steady, but the way she stood still for a moment, fingers gripping the strap of her worn fabric bag, told Will this: "Look back." Clara followed slowly but surely. The wooden step creaked beneath her boots, the first sound in a house that had known only silence for far too long. He opened the door, didn't gesture. She stepped inside, didn't wait for permission. No words, no exchanged glances. But this silence was not like the silence Clara had lived with before, when no one asked. No one cared. No one noticed she was there. This silence held the shape of something that did not look away. The sun was sinking low then. Its slanting light touched the wooden walls, casting soft golden streaks across the floor, a kind of warmth this house had rarely known. Will took off his hat and hung it on the old hook where Miriam used to hang her embroidered scarf. Clara stood in the center of the room, not touching anything. Her hands still rested on her belly, as if that was the only part of her body she still believed belonged to her. The last breeze of the day slipped through a crack in the door. Outside, the old horse gently rubbed against the post, a habit no one had corrected for years. Inside, a woman who had once been sold had crossed a threshold without being invited, and a man who had poured 2 cups of coffee every morning for the past had just poured a chance no one dared to name. Clara didn't step deeper into the house right away. She lingered at the doorway for a long while, letting her eyes adjust to a different kind of light. Not the flickering oil lamp dimmed to save fuel, nor the piercing glances she had grown used to, but a kind of light that didn't judge. The house was small, rough wood, unstained, the walls bearing hairline cracks like spider webs. A square table with 2 chairs. On it, an old ceramic jar of salt. A black cast-iron stove stood against the wall, with a few dented pots hanging above. Everything looked as if time had passed through slowly. Clara reached out and gently touched the back of one chair, its color dulled by sweat or memory. Her finger traced the table's edge, pausing at a small chip, the kind people bump into and never bother to fix. Will stood off to the right, saying nothing. He let her look, let the house speak in its own way. Clara looked farther in, at a door slightly ajar, leading into the bedroom. Her footsteps carried the sound of breath, not from her shoes, they were too old for that, but a quiet sound, made when a pregnant woman crosses into a space no one had prepared for her. Inside was a narrow bed, a hand-knit blanket folded neatly at the foot. Beside it, a small cabinet slightly open holding 3 old books, pages yellowed not by age, but by having been read again, and was 4. But in that instant, Clara knew it had once been filled with someone's quiet hopes. Maybe for planting, maybe to hold a cushion, or maybe just a space to collect things that didn't yet have a name. Will stood behind her, still outside the doorway. He didn't step in, but his gaze on Clara didn't waver, not to watch over, but to make sure he was truly witnessing someone learning how to trust a house again. Clara turned around. She didn't say thank you, didn't ask, "Am I allowed to stay?" She simply nodded, placed her fabric bag at the foot of the bed, rubbed her belly gently, and sat on the edge of the mattress like someone who no longer feared scratching the bedsheet. Will turned and walked out. On the narrow path to the chicken coop, he paused for a few seconds and looked toward the dry lavender. They hadn't bloomed again, but he wasn't disappointed. Because just like this house, some things need silence for a long time before they begin to grow. Inside, Clara sat still. She looked around, not touching anything else. But her eyes began to soften, in the way someone does when they are still afraid but no longer believe they deserve to be. No one spoke for the rest of the afternoon. And because of that silence, the house, which had only ever been a shell of wood, finally began to hold human warmth. That first night, no one called anyone's name. Will lit the oil lamp, not to brighten the room, but so that golden light could soften the hard corners the house had grown too used to. The stove was lit, just enough to keep the cold air from settling in completely. Clara didn't sit by the fire. She leaned lightly against the bedroom door frame, hand on her back, belly tilted to the side like an unsteady pot. No one asked, "Are you hungry?" No one offered to cook. Will took the soaked dried beans from that morning, dropped them into the pot, and added rainwater collected from the eaves. The smell of long-cooked beans filled the air, not delicious, not fragrant, but the kind that reminded you of dinners where no one expected you to be cheerful. Clara didn't eat right away. She held the bowl, sat on a chair, no spoon, no words. Will placed his own portion on the table, then stepped back into a corner of the room to wipe down another oil lamp. Between them, only the crackle of the stove and the warm scent of ash. When the sky turned fully dark, Clara stood, holding her belly, and walked toward the bedroom. Will looked up, his eyes resting on the folded blanket at the end of the bed. It was the blanket Miriam had knit. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. Each year, he only aired it out once, not to use it, but because he feared if it lose something still clinging to its threads. It wasn't thick, not enough to block out the West's October winds. But it was the only thing in that room that still carried the warmth of someone who once stayed. She laid it over herself, lay on her side, belly facing the wall, arm curled around her knees. Not a defensive posture, but not one of trust either. Just the way someone lies when they're too tired to keep distance. Will didn't enter, but he stood quietly at the door, eyes on her back, not guarding, not checking, but as if watching over something no one had dared protect for a long time, the sleep of someone who'd never had a place to dream. The wind howled outside, tapping gently on the tin roof. The shutters rattled. Will turned, stepped onto the porch, and pulled an old blanket over the chair. He didn't sleep in the room. That night, the house held two people, each in their own corner, silent, not because they were strangers, but because neither wanted to disturb what had only just begun to soften. In the bedroom, Clara opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling. She didn't blink. Her hands still gripped the edge of the blanket, as if afraid she might wake and find it had all been a mistake. But the blanket didn't smell new. It wasn't perfumed. No one had tucked it in for her. And that made it real. Out on the porch, Will rested his head against the post. He didn't sleep. But he wasn't sad. There was just something tugging faintly at his chest. Not because of the past, not because of Clara, but because, for the first time in years, that blanket had been used for what it was meant for. Not to warm a memory, but to hold someone learning to fall asleep without curling into herself in fear. It didn't rain that night, but the wind came from the south, carrying the scent of old earth and rotting straw, mixing with early morning dew into a smell only the long lonely could recognize, the smell of something no one waits for anymore. Clara woke early, not startled, not because of noise, just because. Some people, after living too long in a world where others speak on their behalf, learn to wake first, just so nothing can catch them off guard. She sat up, hand resting on her belly. She didn't rub it, didn't press, just to remember it was still there. Still there. Still not taken. Outside the door, Will's footsteps crossed the porch. So soft they didn't wake anyone, but enough for Clara to know he'd been up for a while. He was just an arm's length away. Her feet touched the wooden step, and her fingers held the hem of her shirt tightly. The wind pushed her shawl off one shoulder. She didn't fix it. She also didn't shy away from the early sunlight falling across the unwashed side of her face. Sometime later, when Will poured the coffee into tin cups and handed one her way, Clara took it. Her hands didn't tremble, but when they touched the hot rim, Her eyes squinted slightly. No one asked, "Did you sleep well?" No one said, "What are you doing today?" Not out of coldness, but because some silences are meant to stay untouched, like snow that should be left to melt on its own, not brushed away by hand. Clara took a sip. Her eyes wandered toward the chicken coop, where sunlight had begun to hit the roof. There was a sag in one spot, leaked when it rained, but Will hadn't fixed it. Maybe because no one had needed it yet. A long while passed before she spoke, softly, not asking, not explaining, just like someone telling a story not to be understood, but to set it down. They used to say I was a burden. Will didn't look over. Didn't say, "That's not true." Didn't argue. Didn't console. He simply poured more coffee into his own cup. Clara continued, not because he was listening, but because, for the first time, no one interrupted. My mother-in-law said, I ate more than I worked. My brother-in-law said, this baby was punishment for being weak. They said I did little things and thought I was important. The wind swept past, tossing her hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear, a small motion. But it was the first time she allowed herself to look directly into the daylight. Will set his cup on the ground, then said, not as a declaration, not as an apology for someone else. They were wrong. That was it. Nothing more. No pushing. No evidence needed. And precisely because he didn't say much, those words struck Clara deeper than any defense ever had. She turned to look at him, for the first time since coming to the ranch. Her eyes didn't well up, but her eyelids relaxed, as if something that had been bracing itself for months no longer needed to hold on. You don't even know me. I don't need to. She paused, then nodded gently, not fully agreeing, not exactly disagreeing, just accepting. Accepting that maybe there are people in this world who believe in you, not because they know you, but because they can't bring themselves to believe the opposite. Will picked up the oil no one wanted to name. Will was cutting grass at the edge of the yard. The old iron sickle hissed in a steady rhythm, almost soothing. He wasn't in a hurry, didn't need to be. The only thing he wanted to close now was the distance between himself and the woman sitting on the porch, mending the frayed seam of a faded shirt. Clara hadn't said anything all morning, not because she was sad, not out of fear, but because sometimes people need silence to tally up what no longer has the power to break them. She sat with her back straight, needle weaving carefully. The shirt wasn't hers, it was Will's, but the way she handled each stitch, you could tell something in this house was being deemed, for the first time, worth repairing. Then came the sound of hooves down the red dirt road. Clara stopped sewing. She didn't look, didn't guess, just set the needle down and gripped the fabric, as if her hands had long learned how to brace for ruin. Will looked up. From the foot of the hill, 3 riders approached, slowly, not urgent, not casual, but with that kind of entry that says, we're allowed here, because the law is still written by those holding unpaid notes. The first man wore a wide-brimmed hat, his face weathered, eyes narrow and sharp, like lines drawn in ink across a contract. The other 2, one thin, one stocky, wore gray coats, hands draped over rifle saddles, but hadn't drawn. Will didn't step forward. He stood straight, still holding the sickle. Clara stepped off the porch, unhurried, still holding the half-mended shirt, but not putting it down, as if refusing to let them think her work was done. The lead man spoke. His voice was clipped, firm, not loud. "We came for blood. She's carrying my family's child." Will didn't answer. "The papers are still here. Her husband's dead. His land unsettled. His debts unpaid. She belongs to us. So does the child inside her." Clara stood a few steps away from Will. She didn't hide behind him, didn't lean, just stood like a post, thin but unshaken. The thin man dismounted. His boots struck the ground like iron hoofs. He pulled out a piece of paper, old, creased, but bearing a signature and a red seal. "Her husband, Daniel, signed this debt before he died. If it's not paid, she carries what's left." Will looked at the paper, then at Clara. She didn't blink, didn't shake her head. She just said, in a voice as calm as wind slipping through wooden cracks, "I'm not a debt." The man squinted, smirking. "You think that him from being interrupted? She's already chosen, and here choosing is enough." The air thickened like scorched earth under sun. The three men looked at one another. Then the thin one folded the paper back carefully. "We'll return with the court's men." Will nodded. "Bring the law. But when you do, bring someone who knows how to look another person in the eyes without seeing property." Clara said nothing more. She stood there, hand still resting on her belly, as if that belly now sheltered something no one could take away, the right to stay. The three men turned and rode off. No nod, no farewell. Will didn't go inside. Clara didn't either. They both stood there, not touching, not too close, but close enough that anyone watching would see some things, once held by kindness, cannot be touched by law. Since the day the three men turned their horses and left, the wind on the ranch seemed to shift. It no longer curled under the house or crept beneath the bed like a nameless chill. It rose higher, whistling across the roof, making old boards creak, not in fear, but like a house remembering how to sound when someone lives inside. Will repaired the back door. The rusty hinge hadn't bothered him in 3 years, but that day, watching Clara bend to wash dishes by the porch, he wondered, what if the wind rushes through too hard and hits her back? He didn't ask. He simply picked up his tools and screwed in each hinge, like someone stitching old buttons, not for tidiness, but because finally there was someone worth keeping warm. Clara never mentioned the visit. She kept sweeping the floors, shaking out blankets, putting the salt back in the old ceramic jar. But the way she walked, straighter, eyes less fixed on the ground, told Will that something in her had stopped hiding. One early morning, Will brewed coffee like always. The water bubbled on the stove. The cast-iron kettle hissed. He pulled out 2 tin mugs, a habit never broken, and filled his own. His hand paused above the second. The chair across from him was still empty, Miriam's chair. For 3 years the second cup had always gone there, his way of saying, "I still remember." But this morning, he set it next to the seat still warm from someone else. Clara stepped onto the porch, light jacket on, her hair loosely tied with an old strip of cloth. Will didn't call out. He just slid the mug gently toward her. No invitation, no insistence. But something in that gesture, quiet, simple, grimace. She took a sip, then set it down, cupping the mug between her palms for warmth. The wind picked up again, not cold but enough to make them sit a little closer. Not from need, but because they no longer avoided it. The empty chair remained. No one took its place. But Clara didn't sit there. She chose another, her own. And that small thing was what made Will realize not everyone comes to fill what was lost. Some come just to find a place of their own. Clara didn't step into life at the ranch like someone new. She didn't ask where things went, didn't request permission to use water. She simply started living, as if trying to mend a breath that had once broken. That morning, while Will tilled the soil near the dry well, he saw her crouched beside the old horse. She didn't stroke it the way people do when trying to bond. She just dipped a rag in a bucket and gently wiped around its muzzle. Slow, steady, neither clumsy nor practiced, as if she didn't want the animal to mistake her quietness for pity. The horse didn't move. It stood still, breathing heavy, its tail flicking softly. Will watched from a distance. He said nothing, but for the first time in months, his eyes weren't fixed on the cracks in the fence. Clara began gathering old scraps from the wooden bin. She didn't ask if Will had kept them for anything. She spread them on the table, trimmed frayed edges, and stacked them neatly. The next day, she stitched the pieces together. Not into clothes or rags, just larger, thicker patches. Like someone who had been torn once, trying to make something windproof again. Will didn't ask, "What are you making?" Clara didn't offer. But in the evenings after that, he'd see the cloth lining the pot, or laid across the table, or stitched into a shoulder pad on his old jacket. She didn't interfere with his routines, didn't change how he stacked firewood or salted meat. But the way she quietly adjusted small things, like adding a bowl, rinsing an extra spoon, hanging a handkerchief where the breeze would dry it, made the house feel less abandoned, without a single word. Will began to notice things he used to avoid, like how the sunset spilled across the window frame, or the dried mud streak on the back porch. Not because someone reminded him, but because someone quietly cleaned it. One day, he went to the cowshed and saw the door had been propped up with a stone, the same stone he'd once slipped on during a rainstorm. He didn't ask, but something in his chest loosened. Something that had mouths covered before. Will passed by with a hammer in hand. He stopped for a few seconds. Not long, just long enough to see. This was no longer a stranger taking shelter. She was someone bringing breath back into a house even he had once abandoned. Rain fell late that afternoon, tapping softly like someone knocking on memory. No thunder, no wind, just the kind of rain that soaked wooden walls and made already hollow hearts a little quieter. Will set down his hammer as the sky dimmed. He pulled his old coat over his shoulders and crossed the yard, his boots pressing into the wet earth with heavy, gritty sounds. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, arms wrapped around her belly, eyes looking out onto the porch. The oil lamp behind her cast her shadow long on the floor, not wavering, but not quite upright either. Will stepped in, laid a bundle of damp firewood beside the stove. He didn't speak, didn't stare, just took off his coat, draped it over the chair, and sat quietly near the hearth. The fire wasn't warm yet, but the house had already begun to soften. A little while later, Clara stepped out, carrying a coarse blanket. She didn't wrap it around herself, didn't drape it over her shoulders. She just stood there, looked around, then lowered herself into the chair, the one a full chair's distance away from Will. They didn't look at each other. Between them was the scratched wooden table, the kettle still clicking gently, and the steady sound of rain on the tin roof, that old rhythm that drowns out all words that don't need to be spoken. Will exhaled softly. His hand rested on his knee, thumb tapping absently against the seam of his trousers. A distant rumble of thunder, faint, like someone repeating something that no longer mattered. Clara pulled the blanket over her knees. She didn't wrap it completely, just enough to hold in a bit of breath so that no one had to be afraid of trembling. Will shifted slightly toward the stove, not closer to her, but just enough for the firelight to cast a warm orange hue across both their faces. She was the one who spoke first. She didn't look at him. She didn't ask a question. She simply let the words go, like something that had sat too long on her tongue and now had no reason to stay hidden. "Do you think people can start over?" Will turned toward her, slowly. He didn't nod, didn't say yes. He just laid his hand flat on the table, palm down, the way someone might do when sitting beside a fevered child, so the other knows they're not alone. Clara nodded, not because the answer satisfied her, but because she had just allowed herself to believe again. Poured hot water into a tin cup and slid it gently toward her. She took it, sipped a little. They said nothing more, just sat there, together but without defense, not pitying each other, not trying to heal one another. The rain kept falling, steady as breath, and in that space, for the first time since laughter had vanished from this house, two people sat by the same fire, and no one had to curl up to protect themselves. The cold came earlier than usual that year. In Red Hollow, the mist came by mid-March, and the ground stayed hard as stone from morning until noon. Wild plum branches at the edge of the woods had just begun to bud, barely, but just enough to give someone a reason to step out to the porch each morning, even knowing nothing new was waiting. Clara went into labor on a windless night. Will was sitting down, prying old nails from rotting planks, when he heard the sound of a bowl dropping. Small, but sharp enough to make him rise without thinking. Clara was gripping the edge of the table, her lips pressed tight, one hand clutching the side of the chair, the other on her belly, her chest rising in short waves. Her eyes weren't wide, but that look was no longer the look of a woman once auctioned in a public square. It was the look of someone who knew she had to go on, not for herself. Will didn't ask anything. He didn't know what question would help. He just pulled the chair closer, spread the old blanket across the floor, and lit another oil lamp. Outside, the wind hissed softly through the door frame. Inside, the smell of wood ash, warmth, old cotton, and an unspoken fear blended into something people might call devotion. Not love, not duty, just that one thing that keeps a person from walking away. Will set a pot of water on the stove. He rummaged in the drawer, found the clean cloth Clara had laundered and folded weeks ago. The house seemed to shrink, pulling itself into one small room, where a man who had long lived like a shadow was gathering up the last scraps of warmth to help someone not drift away. The first cry escaped when the wall clock struck 10. Clara didn't scream. She just clutched the table harder, her back arched like a bow drawn tight. Will crouched low beside her. His hands trembled, not from fear, but because he knew this was the first time in his life he would see a child born, with no one there to hold it first. The baby arrived just after midnight. No piercing cry, no rush of blood, just a soft breath, a tiny murmur, and then a pair of eyes opened, not seeing yet, but already knowing warmth was close. Will sat there, hands soaked in warm water. Right away, she just closed her eyes and let out a breath, like a wound finally stitched that no longer hurt. Will wrapped the baby in a thin wool blanket, the one his wife had knitted but never got to use. He placed it in Clara's arms, said nothing, just gave her a piece of the world that from now on would never be the same. Clara looked down, not in awe, not overwhelmed, just the gaze of someone who had once been deemed worthless, now holding something that no one else would ever price again. And under that old wooden roof, in the cold night, with frost still clinging to the ground, spring had begun, not with white plum blossoms, but with a single look. Morning came. A fine layer of mist hadn't yet lifted, still curling beneath the fence posts and along the path to the horse barn. The sun hadn't fully risen, just enough light to cast a long shadow from the porch to the patch of old lavender. Will stood in the kitchen, still holding the watering can, not yet poured over the young beans Clara had planted behind the house. He stopped when he saw her. Clara sat on the wooden chair, her back tilted slightly, hair draped over her shoulder, arms cradling the baby still asleep in the blanket. A soft golden light slanted across her face, illuminating her cheek with a gentleness Will hadn't seen since the day she entered his life. She didn't speak, didn't know he was watching. She just rocked slowly, as if some melody only she could hear was lulling the baby, and also herself. Will didn't step out right away. He stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, his aging eyes tightening, not from pain, but because for the first time he no longer saw the shadow of his late wife in that figure on the porch. For 3 years, every time he placed a cup of coffee on the table across from him, every time he opened the window to let the wind blow through the white curtains, every time sunlight touched the old table, Will would instinctively look for a familiar silhouette, a faded ghost blurred beyond memory. He had lived with that memory like someone lives with a pain they don't want to leave, because if it leaves, what would be left to live with? But this morning, he saw only Clara. A real person, sitting there, living, not filling in. The girl who had once been sold beneath the old wooden cross at the town square, who had followed him home without a word of blame, who once didn't believe she even deserved a porch to sit under, now cradled the life she had carried, with the instinct of someone born to protect something fragile. Will slowly poured water into the old horse's bowl, set the jug on the table, and stepped onto the and whispered, her voice soft as mist being lifted by breeze. Haven't named her yet. Will nodded. No suggestion, no pressure, no need to know more. He understood some things don't need to be rushed. Like names, like love. Like the slow mending of a soul, too long convinced it wasn't worth naming. Clara turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. And in that look, there was no gratitude, no lingering shame. Just one person, seeing another. And Will, on that sunlit morning, felt for the first time, that he no longer owed a ghost anything. He was no longer running. He was simply a man, standing on his own porch, looking at two people who hadn't come to fill an old hole, but to open a door long untouched. On a Friday morning, Will returned to town after more than 3 weeks away. He needed a bag of feed for the horse and a spool of hemp thread so Clara could mend the curtain by the porch. The sun was gentle, the dirt road dry, golden dust rising each time a wagon rolled past. The people of Red Hollow weren't loud, but anything that happened, even quietly, was retold at least 3 times, each time a little different. The first time they said, "Old Harrow brought home some pregnant girl from who knows where." The second time they whispered, "She was auctioned off behind the church. Betty took her in out of pity." But the third time, when they saw Will step down from his wagon, pause by the store door to retie the frayed rope on the wheel, no one said anything anymore. He entered the shop and nodded to the storekeeper. The air inside was the same as ever, the smell of pine wood, coarse cloth, cheap soap, and dust warmed by sunlight. A few people stood nearby, 2 farmers' wives picking out bags of salt, a young stock boy carrying a sack of flour. They glanced at Will, but this time their eyes held no judgment, just the kind of look people give when they've known grief and now see someone who no longer wears mourning. The boy stammered, "Do you need more rope, sir? The kind she picked out last time?" Then he trailed off, realizing what he'd said. Will didn't speak, just nodded. Outside, the sunlight cast long lines across the wooden steps, cutting a diagonal beam through Will's silhouette as he turned to leave. The storekeeper's wife, with soft cloth, sleeping soundly beneath a wide-brimmed hat Will had hung by the door. An old woman walking past stopped.
She didn't ask anything, just clicked her tongue softly. "Planting like that, you'll have fruit next spring."
A sentence that seemed casual, but it was the first time Clara was seen not as a question mark, but as someone who lived here. In roadside cafes, conversations began to shift tone when they spoke of them.
"Will's fixing up the old barn again."
"That Clara girl grows damn good tomatoes."
No one called her the pregnant one who got sold anymore. No one called him the old man who brought home trouble. Only small nods remained. Not agreement, but recognition. That on this dry and unforgiving land, something had quietly taken root. Something small, but steady. Not reputation, not debt repaid, but kindness, passed on simply by not speaking ill anymore. One early autumn morning, the wind changed. No longer the scorching heat of summer, not yet the chill that demanded extra layers. The air was clean, carrying the scent of fresh grass and last night's damp firewood. Will had just finished setting a new wooden post in the backyard. The post had been cut from the old kapok tree that died years ago, the very one his wife had chosen for their first vine trellis. He hadn't replaced it, just wrapped its cracks with hemp, braced its base with a brick support, as if preserving something too old to abandon. Clara stood nearby, holding the baby, now old enough to grab her mother's finger, to turn toward warmth, to cry for no reason. She wasn't wearing white. It was just a worn indigo shirt, pants patched twice at the knees, but clean and neat. Will wore his old dress shirt, the kind he only put on for church or to bury someone. The collar still had a small tear from the day he'd ripped it open in panic when his wife stopped breathing. A clumsy act by a man who didn't know what to do, with pain pouring out from the heart. There was no preacher, no big crowd, just the Townsend couple, neighbors at the bottom of the hill, and the old seed seller, the one who had whispered more than once about Clara, but also the first to say,
"If someone needs a hand to hold during the prayer, I'll be there."
Will said no vows, neither needed no embellishment. That afternoon there was no feast. Clara made a pot of white beans, cut up some young corn, set them on the old table beside the hearth. Will poured 2 glasses of water, not whiskey, not coffee. He didn't offer. She didn't need to be invited. They sat down, side by side. Nothing changed, except now neither of them lowered their gaze. In Red Hollow, no wedding was recorded that day, no certificate, no newspaper notice. Just a few folks passing the Harrow gate who paused, saw kitchen smoke rising, heard a baby laugh between the breezes, and slowly bowed their heads, as if acknowledging something without a name. The evening settled slowly, like the days inching toward winter. The air wasn't cold yet, but brisk enough to make an old hand feel dry, skin pull tight at the knuckles. Will was mending the west side of the barn. Each hammer strike felt like tapping memory, not painful, but leaving an echo. Beside him, a low pile of old wood, remnants of the floor where his wife once stood, where she had shouted with joy when the first calf was born right there. He didn't replace everything, just the rotted boards, kept the ones still strong, even if they were cracked with age. On the porch, Clara rocked the baby. She didn't sing with words, only soft, humming tones without melody, as if remembering something while creating it. Her hair fell gently down, sunlight slipping through each strand like morning smoke. The baby slept in her arms, tiny hand reaching blindly for the fabric of her blouse. Clara didn't hush, didn't sway, just sat there, letting each breath of hers blend with the fragile rhythm of a new life. Will didn't turn around, but he heard, not the sound, but something deeper, a kind of trust, the kind not everyone recognizes when it first sprouts. For 3 years, he had lived in silence, not because he disliked speaking, but because he feared that words might shatter something sacred that once belonged to his life. He had learned to hold everything in his eyes, his hands, his breath, and now, in that same old house, he was learning again how to be trusted. Not with vows, not with credentials, but simply by still being here, still mending the barn, still raising the fence, still splitting firewood each evening. So the woman and child wouldn't be cold by nightfall. No one told him to do it. No one said he had to be silent or to show it. But in the West, where people learn to live from the earth, from the wind, from the light, and from scarcity, everyone knows this. Trust doesn't come from what is said. It comes from what is still done, even when no one asks. That night, Clara placed the child in the cradle Will had kept in storage. A lavender from the drawer. Will set a glass of water by the window. Not whiskey, not coffee, just water, cool and full. The house now held 3 people. No one changed the other's past, but through quiet kindness, with no conditions, they were learning to live without fear of being left behind. Outside, the wind swept across the field. The moon rose behind the roof, casting its light over the porch, where a salt-and-pepper-haired man stood silently, gazing out, not waiting for anyone, not remembering anyone. Just, for the first time in many years, he felt he could stay. Not because anyone asked him, not because anyone begged, but because this time he chose not to turn away. No one called this love. No one made demands for gratitude or reciprocation. It was simply that, in a place once too dry for anything new to grow, 2 people, one once sold, the other, who had lost everything, quietly chose to stay beside each other. Not because of expectations, but because of a cup of coffee placed in the right spot, a figure that didn't walk away, a gaze that didn't flinch. And maybe that's how a home comes back to life, from things no one thought could be forgiven. If you've ever lived through days when no one was waiting for you to come home, if you've ever had to hold yourself up in a world that offered no room for collapse, then maybe you understand. Sometimes, something as small as someone pouring that second cup of coffee in the morning is enough to help someone lift their head and go on. Do you remember someone who once did something kind for you for no reason at all? Write it down, just one line. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be clear. Just so someone else passing through might know. Kindness still exists, and it's still quietly spreading. Thank you for staying till the end of this story. If your heart feels a little warmer now, leave a word, not for us, but for the moments that once helped you believe in people again.